Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. And these books are available for viewing at thephilosophicalangle.com. If you'd like to comment on the program, you can give us an email at chrisangle, CHRISANGLE, the numeral 1, at gmail.com. And along with me is my colleague and co-host, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale as an MBA from Wharton and is an independent venture capitalist. Good to see you, Rick.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle program is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media and, secondarily, to use those definitions to understand the righteousness and ethical superiority of conservative positions. And we're going to this week talk about the admission scandal that has racked us, several universities. And kind of what brought this up was an article in the New York Times called "The Admission Scandal is Really a Sports Scandal." And I have the article here, and it's by David Leonhardt, and he opens with an alleged admissions conspiracy is able to exist only because of the ridiculously large role that athletics plays in college admissions. He says getting a peek inside the college admissions process isn't easy, but a team of academic researchers managed to do so several years ago. He says that the biggest boost went to recruited athletes. An athlete was about 30 percentage points more likely to be admitted than a non-athlete with the same academic record. He said the alleged scam, if the accusations are true, he says they're outrageous. But they also highlight a larger problem that has somehow become acceptable. A scam like this could exist only because competitive sports occupy a ridiculously large place in the admissions process. And he says that the situation is different with other extracurricular activities. And he gives some examples how the athletic program is boosted more than other types of programs. So he concludes by saying it's time to end the extreme special treatment that colleges give to so many of them. College sports can still exist without it. Well, I think we need to ask, is an university athletic tradition an important part of the university's culture? Does this question really pertains not only to these scandals, but really to any university that has an athletic program. There were only some particular majors that were caught up in the scandal, but should it be extrapolated into the entire future of all universities' programs? So in general, we're asking, is it important for a university to promote an athletic tradition within its culture? So how do we determine this? How do we come up with an answer of whether a university should involve itself with building an athletic program? What's our first step in being able to answer this question? Well, the first thing to do is to understand the purpose of a college or university. And I think that purpose is one of higher learning, obviously, which is to prepare the student for his future. And of course, students require higher knowledge at the university to prepare themselves socially and for vocationally. And so we need to now compare this purpose of athletics, which is to promote the physical development of the student, to the as physical development of his biological being, and compare it to the learning aspects. The student, the student's academic learning matches, of course, perfectly with the university's first objective. But there seems to be a problem with the athletics. It doesn't fit perfectly within the university's first objective. It seems only to fit in secondarily because the athletic programs provide some antecedent learning, but there seems to be a conflict, and this writer from the New York Times has pointed it out. And this is because the universities have a developed athletic program. And also, if you look back at history, we understand that in Western culture, though, many of the historical places of learning also practiced and glorified athleticism. Look at the Greek tradition. They developed the Olympics. People of higher learning have historically placed a priority and a significance on university on athleticism, and why is that? Maybe we haven't defined the university's objectives sufficiently enough to come to a conclusion about this. Well, there's an old Latin saying that might give us a clue to this, and it's mens sano in corpore sano, which means a sound mind in a sound body. So what is lacking in our understanding here? And I think it's because we have to include an understanding of athletics in order for us to come to a sufficient answer. The Greeks and afterwards the Romans understood that the ultimate goal of the individual is to follow the aesthetic life, and one should do that which is beautiful. So really the purpose of the university should be expanded to include aesthetics, or that which is the study of beauty. The student should be learning, should be directed by that which is aesthetic, which includes learning, but it also includes the complete development of oneself. I think we need to stop and should probably define the concept of aesthetics. So I'll do that now. So aesthetics is the extreme of what nature has produced in any particular niche. That is, beauty is the extreme evolutionary development of any niche that has been produced by nature, by evolution. And the extreme, that which is exemplified by best by the organism's success in its niche to exist, to survive, to prosper, and bring goodness to its life. If it's an extreme in that, with that objective, it's aesthetic. A couple of examples here would be like an Arabian horse. It's an extreme in its niche, in which it exemplifies how evolution was able to go so far in that particular niche and has produced such a great animal. But it doesn't necessarily stop with the animate. It can also in the inanimate. If you look up the stars at night, if you look up into over an ocean, and you can see, you have the feeling of aesthetics and beauty. And the reason you do is because your aesthetic sense gives you the understanding that what you see is conducive to being for your existence, for your prosperity, and for your goodness of your life. And so if we let aesthetics guide us, we can avoid the conclusion of the termination of the athletic programs. as the New York columnist pointed out. Let's enough of me. Let's see what Rick has to say, especially since his university was caught up in this particular problem. Rick, what's your take?
Well, athletics throughout history has been known as a very important means of fostering discipline, cooperation when you compete on the team, competition, right? It's no accident that many of the most successful professional people are also very good at sports. I mean, you find this on Wall Street, you find it in a lot of areas of business, because many of those qualities are directly applicable to real life. And by contrast, pure academics are often much less successful in the real world. Our greatest military generals have not tended to be steeped in pure academics. Some of our best presidents were not academicians. You see it over and over. Business leaders. There are many business leaders that had relatively little education, but were quite successful in sports and other activities. So the notion that sports doesn't play a useful role in molding an individual, not exclusively, but importantly, is not demonstrated in real life experience. That would be the first point. The second is that certainly in the Ivy League, there are no athletic scholarships, right? So that is one reason Ivy League teams tend to be rather poor by national standards, and you could possibly put a Yale football team or basketball team up against one of the state schools. The gap is too wide, and that holds for most of the Ivy League teams. So to think that the Ivy League in particular is overemphasizing sports at the expense of other avenues of human endeavor, I think that's a fairly weak case, just judging from the performance of their teams and their athletes. And I also think the article misses the mark in terms of what's really responsible for this catastrophic decline in honesty and focus on meritocracy at so many universities. And mind you, this investigation is still unfolding, and all the indications are that the number of guilty parties is numerous, numbering in the hundreds. And I think only about 30 parents mainly have been charged. So much more is yet to come. What we've discovered thus far, however, is that gaming the system, it takes all kinds of forms. There are students that are white that have claimed to be black. There are students that have cheated on the exams, like the ACT and the SAT. They've had other persons take the exams for them. They've been able to get special handicap accommodation and get the exams monitored by, shall we say, friendly individuals, alone in a room with no one else monitoring. There are all kinds of ways the system's being gamed. So the admissions system itself is corruptly managed. There's obviously a lack of control. It's very broad. It's in many areas. It applies to the sports teams. It also applies to checking to see what the actual racial identity of an individual is. Because if you miss something as obvious as that, it's pretty clear you're missing, pretty basic information about a student. But why is it? How is it possible all these distortions are allowed to occur so broadly? That's the central question. And to my mind, what it comes down to is an ever-growing impulse within the universities to change the focus from the concept of meritocracy within the context of trying to develop well-rounded individuals to something that more closely resembles an attempt to centralize control within the admissions department such that it is able to concoct a class that champions diversity, right, over more traditional bases for deciding on who gets admitted. And therein lies enormous scope for mischief, because you're putting the ultimate power in the control of nameless administrators who basically decide their own criteria based on whatever social agenda they have. And I'm deliberately putting this in the extreme, as opposed to an objective set of criteria by which one could be admitted. Let's contrast what we now find to be the U.S. approach, which is obviously flawed, against that of other countries. I remember visiting the École Normale in Paris and having a discussion with one of the French academics, and they were critiquing the U.S. admissions policy, and particularly the policy of admissions at Yale, because in their mind, the single criterion by which a student was admitted there was a score, a test score. You either scored above a certain level on the national test, or you didn't. And to them, that was fair, right? Objective, in the sense of being objective. And if you fail to reach that score, I mean, this is one of the best universities in France. It's one of the Grand Écoles, and so forth. It's equivalent to one of the Ivy Leagues, or Stanford, or MIT, or whatever. And so in their view, by diluting the admissions policy with all these other factors, you probably weren't getting the best students. And in fact, you were unfairly turning away students that should have been admitted in favor of students that were less qualified. That was their fundamental critique of the U.S. system. And they have a point. They have a point. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the U.S. system, be it Yale or any of the other Ivy League schools or similar schools, needs to move to that extreme. But if you don't want these kinds of distortions where the system gets gamed, you need to have objective criteria. I would go a step further, and I would suggest that it's high time the Ivy Leagues made the criteria by which they admit students public knowledge. They are publicly funded universities. They derive enormous funding from the federal government, from taxpayers. They owe it to the taxpayer, they owe it to the public to come clean. And in fact, that's what these lawsuits are about, particularly the one at Harvard. But it's the same issue everywhere. The universities have been very, very defensive about not revealing these criteria, and one has to assume it's because it's indefensible. There's got to be a reason they're not honest about it. It has to be. One has to assume in the absence of other information, that something's not quite objective there. And they could clear the air in a minute. They could reveal the criteria and announce it publicly. They could announce it in the New York Times, but they won't. And so one has to remain very, very suspicious of their motives. And hopefully, this scandal will lead to a requirement that the universities are more honest about how they actually operate. And it will probably require turning over a number of administrators and presidents of universities and boards of trustees as well, because their oversight has obviously been lacking or non-existent.
Rick, thanks very much for your insight. I thought it was pretty helpful in understanding the subject. And we'll see everybody again next week on the Philosophical Angle.